Вас вітати. Добрий день, друзі. Раді вас вітати. Хто з нами, хто нас дивиться в прямому ефірі. Наші діалоги в часі продовжуються. Спілкуємося далі. Зараз ми поговоримо з Олександром Сушком, виконавчим директором Міжнародного фонду відродження.
The next speaker is Alexandra Sushko, the executive director of Renaissance Foundation. We will first watch the video of March 2014. As to our relations with the European Union, it's obvious that the Council of Europe, which will have meeting on Thursday, Friday, we have big expectations from this meeting. First of all, further steps as to reacting to challenges which are so dynamic and which are changing the situation. The Council of Europe is the highest level of heads of states who will get together to discuss further sanctions against the aggressor, the Russian Federation, and also actions towards Ukraine and other countries of Western Europe. For us, it's very important that hopefully on Friday at lunchtime, almost legendary document, the document which gave birth to the crisis, will be signed. We remember the dramatic events of the Vilnius summit of Eastern Partnership when the refusal to sign the association agreement cost Ukraine stability, cost Viktor Yanukovych political future. We hope that the day after tomorrow, this, if not full stop, then comma in the process will be put, and we will this way complete the dramatic cycle of our history. And since then, we will get strong foundation for our further steps together with Europe. Thank you, Alexandra. I'd like to talk about European Union. That was the topic of your presentation then, but we still have many challenges which are related to implementation and support of Ukraine by European countries. So what are your ideas 5 years after? Evgen Bystritsky was with us, and the Renaissance Foundation played a very important role in creation of the UCMC. I would like to thank you because I remember the meeting that we had in Valery Charles' office. Mr. Bystritsky was there. We need to start something. There was a team there. And then the question was where to get money to lease the premises at Ukraina Hotel. And then Renaissance Foundation said, tomorrow you will get money to lease the office and the first equipment. And that was the seed capital which we needed to launch. We thank you for that. And now I suggest to talk about European Union. Thank you. In fact, these 5 years passed fast and dynamically. They changed a lot. Now when you watch these videos, we understand how far away we were then from where we are today. Because then we were talking about signing the basic agreement with the EU, but today we have the results of implementation. We see how European Union grew up as foreign trade partner from 23-24% of the volume of foreign trade to approximately 42 now. That is very significant growth, and the association agreement helped that. And we now have new items of export between Ukraine and the EU. Me, as an expert on these issues, I cannot be fully satisfied with the process because the association agreement itself was the list of certain rules, but these are rules which do not act automatically. If you ratify the agreement and do nothing else, it will not help. It starts helping when gradually, step by step, you implement the program of changes, because association agreement is the algorithm of changes, in which order and within what framework it is to be implemented. And then the executive bodies need to analyze whether they can execute. And on the one hand, we state the progress, and we see certain results, but at the same time, we see that the results could be much bigger, and then possibly the citizens would feel the interest, more interest to continuation of the processes. Otherwise, we see that the citizens don't have many benefits from the processes that are taking place. There is a visa-free regime for active part of the population. That is a great change. But this part of the population which uses this visa-free regime, it's not very big. It's not 100% of the population. And that is why there's a lot of skepticism in the society whether European integration brought some improvement. And so we have where to grow more. And what concerns us is that we concentrate too much on general declarative things. On the one hand, the association agreement itself is the level when we stopped declaring. We signed absolutely specific plan of changes, but declarations are very important. We have changed the constitution to fix the European and Euro-Atlantic course, and maybe symbolically that's good, but it doesn't give us a lot of functionalism. We understand that this is another just political signal. If we see that on the one hand the parliament approves the amendments to the constitution by the constitutional majority, but last week, for example, the parliament lacked votes to approve absolutely needed laws. The parliament failed the law which created opportunities for Ukraine to join ASA European agreement, which will make it easier for industrial goods to get to the market. So we ourselves do not create opportunities which we can create, even though the European Union, not for all the countries, opens up such an opportunity to join this regime. Our diplomats have been working long so that within this association we join the regime and we implement certain norms. And then our industrialists, without certificate barriers, they can free trade with Europe. No, we lacked votes for that. Then the Constitutional Court cancels the article of the Criminal Code, which is so important for Europeans. Europeans were emphasizing that for modern Europe, criminal punishment for illegal enrichment is a very important part of their criminal law standards. They canceled. Now we'll try to do something. We created the problem out of nothing. And now we are concerned with how certain achievements in providing gender equality, how this thing is opposed. For Europeans, these things, this non-desired, this inertia are more noticeable than our amendments to the Constitution, and many believe that we are not sincere in everything, and that is the problem we need to state, and we need not stop on what we have achieved. What about implementation of association agreement? I know that every half a year there's a review of how Ukraine's progressing. What are the biggest problems? You mentioned these draft laws which were not passed last week. This is a shame, but where else? Where we have progress, where nothing is happening? Recently, Renaissance Foundation published the expert opinion on the status of implementation of association agreement, which covers 14 different sectors of economy, and we see very uneven results. There's more progress in one area, less in another. There's less progress where there are powerful lobbyist interests present, of those who are interested in the situation as it is, or very expensive reforms like environmental standards of the EU. They cost a lot, and that is why the agreement provides for quite long transitional period so that the standards are implemented, because we have many industrial companies which do not correspond to all these standards of the European Union. But in some spheres, there's lobbying, the attempt to preserve preferences. And we see, for example, in the sphere of export control and metallurgical sector, thanks to the efforts of lobbyists, the export duty for scrap metal will be increased. It looks like a simple thing, but there are certain interests of someone's pocket are behind it. They say that that is the interests of the national producer, but these are the interests of someone's pocket. And it's not easy to overcome that, because a different interest is not so well organized. If we sign something, then we need to implement, because if we do not implement, then the trust will be low. Transportation sector, the level of implementation is very low there. Not everything is the Ukrainian side which is guilty for these things, because in certain cases, like Britain or Spain, cannot come to an agreement, but in most cases it's more Ukrainian side. We have an open dialogue, so if you have questions to Alexandra, raise your hand. Andriy. I would have maybe a dozen of questions, but let's start from this thing. Which Europe are we planning to get integrated with? Because the agreement is something of the past. We are in which Europe are we getting integrated? When will we be able to get integrated? What steps should we make so that we get to Europe about which we are dreaming? Thank you. The agreement is quite dynamic. It provides for the mechanism of renewal. Some mechanisms work in automatic mode. If, for example, there was certain regulation, European regulation in a certain sector, but now there's a new regulation, then we implement the new regulation. We do not have to implement the one that we had back in 2013. Some mechanisms are operating automatically. In some cases where there's a reference to some documents, then there's a mechanism of updating. 5 years later we got this right and the mechanism is launched. If in the addendum there's the list of documents which Ukraine has to adapt, Now changes are introduced into these addenda, and we implement the version of European norms which are applicable today but not some time ago. That's not the first agreement like that, and such agreement provides for this dynamic process of approval. It's not a dead agreement of 2013. Experts are discussing that also. Maybe we could not envisage everything. It's a subject of expert discussion. What is to be changed? Maybe certain things will require more serious changes, but the most important thing is that many changes could be made without any re-ratification, so that we don't think that it is something very complicated. There is a Council of Association, Committees of Association. The Council of Associations is authorized to practically modernize the agreement. By the decisions of the Council of Associations, we can very seriously introduce changes into the existing regime of Ukraine's integration. That mechanism was used by other countries that have similar agreements, and Ukrainian side has to understand that we too have this opportunity when we both parties see that something is obsolete, then talking about into which Europe Ukraine is integrating. I understand why you are asking that. Aren't we late in setting the objectives and tasks? Aren't we trying to get integrated into something past? But in fact, the association agreement sets the regime of access to markets, not just European markets. In many respects, it makes it easy. Opening the access to European markets, we open other markets for us, many other markets, because the unification is working in the world, and meeting European standards is like pass to other markets. It's useful in itself, it works, and it's justified. If now, for example, in Europe, the talks, especially in the context of Brexit, if it's popular to say whether all components are justified, hasn't Europe gone too far in this integration? Then who knows, maybe our model of this limited integration will be acceptable. Maybe it corresponds more to the current times when the countries are more responsible to taking the sovereignty to the regional level. Local experts say that probably the model that Ukraine has with the European Union, so maybe finally Britain will get to something similar. They don't want to lose all the benefits of the integration, but they will not be the members of the EU. Basically, this model doesn't give us a full-fledged membership in the EU, but it gives us a lot for integration with the European market. I would like to remind you of one event. There's Volochysk, and there I have a friend who makes agricultural equipment, which was used to import equipment from Europe. And after the association agreement was made effective, he found out that many people in Europe are interested in those trals, and then he registered the company in Poland. He received all the certification, And all that certification was the certification of the European Union, and now they're exporting this equipment to European market. And if we didn't have this agreement, it would have been impossible from the point of view of there. And I see how small and medium-sized business started using the association agreement, because a lot is related to educational work, what is done from the point of view of promoting. Understand there is Renaissance Foundation, the state, and are involved into promotion. How do we communicate all the advantages of the association, because the issue of the EU is very complicated, and very often the citizens of the EU do not understand what is the EU. So what do you think about that? I would talk about three major levels of rights: information work, for example, if we are thinking about proper competences of those who are involved in the public administration, every ministry should have a department, a deputy minister, who would be responsible for European issues, and we need to have a big mass of people who understand these things. It's not in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but in all sectoral ministries. That was very difficult, because 5 years ago, the level of competences of the sectoral ministries on European policy was very, very low. Now it's not ideal, but it's much better. The second level is informing those who have their own interest. First of all, I'm talking about business. Business does not receive automatic benefits from the association with the EU. It's just an instrument that you can use, or you maybe will not use it, but you can use it in case you know how it works. And here, business itself, understanding all that, invests into hiring the specialists, to train their own specialists, to study the markets, to work with foreign markets, first of all European, looking for right counteragents, and to modernize own business. Because when it comes to production, following standards, industrial standards, are of importance, or production standards, because association with the EU is not just making customs duties zero, but that's access to very regulated market. Every commodity has a certain standard which you need to correspond to, and you need to correspond not just to commodity in its final form, but the process of manufacturing this commodity should correspond to certain standards, which means that, for example, if some cattle raising company or agricultural company wants to get access to European market, then they have to be certified that the production corresponds to sanitary, phytosanitary standards, European standards. Only then they can enjoy this trading regime. We have a fact which is interesting. Ukrainian industry of making chicken is very closely integrated into global and European market, because big manufacturers, big producers, they have adapted all these sanitary standards which were needed. And we can say nothing, but we cannot say that about the pork producers. We sell a lot of chicken to Europe, but zero of pork, because pork producers, they have not been certified yet. when it comes to cattle breeding, the sanitary requirements are very high. What's done? Business is interested in that. It examines the rules and adapts them. Is there any assistance? A lot. We participated, and basically what we can do is limited, but there are many sources where business could get information about what could be done. I personally participated a lot in such trainings when we would travel to different regions of Ukraine, telling to representatives of local business what should they know to be successful in European markets. There are experts who are required. And I would add education to that, because that's a huge factor which makes people look for the possibility to get high quality education in Europe. And the next level is the general level. People should know, especially what is European integration. That's school education and access to information and internet. I cannot say that we have some big breakthrough. Still, there's a lot of mythology, there's low awareness here, but Ukraine is not unique here. The fact that the integration processes are very complicated to sell it easily, that is what we have in the European Union as to European Union. And sometimes it's related to the fact that politicians are not able to correctly sell the benefits to which they used to the society. They automatically perceive these benefits, and they do not understand that that's thanks to the European Union, but not thanks to something else. And that's the problem in all the EU countries. One more question, the last one from Roman. The mic is not working. About the readiness of the state, it's to not just to positive developments, but to risks of the agreement, like the story about the refusal from subsidies to any base, to any business. Like we cannot help miners, coal miners. We do not know what will happen with chicken because they also need subsidies. So equal rules mean responsibility. First of all, the European Union itself is the economy of subsidies. Basically, how in the European Union the agriculture is subsidized. So nowhere in the world there are so many subsidies as there. So we cannot believe. And the association agreement does not require Ukraine to be better than them. But how in Ukraine we traditionally support the national producer, that needs to be rethought. We need to replace the mechanisms of direct subsidies which do not correspond to current European practices, to the mechanism of more flexible subsidies. I'm not a specialist in that, unfortunately. I cannot talk about details, but there is a certain set of allowed forms of support of different sectors, including agriculture and industry. But again, if the situation is that in the process of implementation we see that there's a moment which sets unequal rules, then that's reason to talk about that at the level of the Council of Association, and that is the mechanism which can remove these problems if something was not provided for. There's enough flexibility to do that, but there are many non-obvious things, and that's an issue for diplomacy. Well, will we be able to prove that the regulation requires that? I believe that here the producers are to be involved into that, because in the European Union the tradition of participation of business in forming state policy is very long. We had a tactic of lobbying when the preferential regime would be formed, but instead we need to use different technologies and to talk to associations, business associations as equals. Thank you. Thank you. I thank you for this discussion. Thank you for the support of the UCMC for getting visa-free regime. You mentioned that we all feel every time when we cross the border, that's what we feel. We understand that we don't have to stand in line to get visas and to give plenty of documents. And that is something that is important. Probably we need to do something to get a visa-free regime with the UK. But thank you for your presentation. Thank you.